There, my people. I want to share this episode of The Adventures of Superman with you because it's an episode where Superman / Clark Kent literally forgets who he is. A humongous asteroid is headed for Earth, and when Superman tries to destroy it by slamming into it, he ends up with amnesia. So what happens when you're the Man of Steel but you don't remember it? Well, let's check it out together. The scene opens with the streets lined with people, their faces turned toward the sky. There's a somber look on most of them, with some being downright scared.
There, it's all right. It's just a meteor, that's all.
Not far is the Daily Planet newspaper building. Reporter Lois Lane is sitting on the opened window ledge with her own face looking up to the darkened sky. Though it's mid-afternoon, the gigantic asteroid has blocked out most of the sun. Cub reporter Jimmy Olsen enters the office with a pair of binoculars and asks Lois if she'd like to look through them. Lois responds, "No thanks, Jim. It doesn't do any good. Can't see anything anyway." The editor-in-chief, Perry White, enters the office and says to Jimmy, "Didn't find Mr. Kent, did you?" Jimmy says, "No, sir. I'm sorry." Lois says, "Clark probably found a nice deep cellar someplace to hide in." Lois sighs and then says, "I'm sorry, I didn't really mean that." Jimmy says, "Nobody said that meteor is going to hit Metropolis. Maybe it won't even hit the Earth." "Asteroid is what the scientists are calling it," White says. "That's a meteor king-sized." Lois asks White, "Did you talk to the observatory?" To which White nods and says, "I wish we could see that blasted thing. At least last night we could see where it was."
It's only flamed up like that when it's past other planets.
That's exactly what I meant before. It zoomed right past Venus and Mars, didn't it?
Jimmy continues, "Just because a big thing runs wild and gallops all over the solar system doesn't mean it's gonna hit us." Lois takes his arm and says, "I know, Jimmy, I know." Jimmy turns to look up at the sky. "It does seem funny we can't see it," Jimmy continues. Lois says, "That's because it's so close it's in the shadow of the Earth." She turns to White and says, "Chief, what did the observatory say?" "Measurements," he says, "just measurements. It's 5.25 miles in diameter, they figure." As the trio is talking, a light shines from overhead, and they all look up in wonder. Jimmy says, "Golly, that isn't daylight, is it?" Next, we see the observatory and the professor staring intently through a giant telescope. That isn't a good look on his face, peeps.
Any change, Professor?
Out of the way. It isn't time. Where's Superman? Superman! Superman!
Over here, Professor. I'm just watching it.
The professor turns to look upward himself and says to Superman, "Your eyes probably do a better job at it than the telescope." Superman says, "It's stopped moving now." The professor says, "It's changed its course. It's starting to burn again. You can't see it move because now it's coming straight towards us." "Straight towards Metropolis?" Superman says. The professor nods. Superman says, "Excuse me, Professor. I've got a date in outer space." "Don't try it, Superman," the professor says. Superman says, "Maybe I can knock it off its course." The professor says, "Listen, they've got spectroscopic photos in there and we can't even identify the minerals and gases in that asteroid." "So," Superman says,
Your powers may have no control over them. Here on Earth, yes, but suppose that's made of kryptonite or some other unknown element from cosmic space which even you can't handle.
That's just a chance we'll have to take.
That's classic Superman, peeps, ready to risk himself with the unknown in one single bound, because he knows what his role and his purpose is, and that's to protect and serve the Earth. And for those of you who need a refresher in just what that is, check out the Superman movie, the one with Christopher Reeves, the only real true Superman as far as I'm concerned. Pull up that movie and pay attention to what his dad, Marlon Brando, tells him his role and purpose is when he's out there at the Fortress of Solitude. His dad tells him what his life's purpose is, peeps, and this is it.
I've chosen Earth for you, and to serve its collective humanity. Live as one of them, Color. To discover where your strength and your power are needed.
Now this is what Brother Man has ringing in his ears and in his heart, peeps. He's been given a purpose and a charge from his dad. A purpose and a charge for his life. A definition for his existence. Can't you see, people? If you know who you are, what your giftings, talents, and strengths are, what your purpose in life is, you'll have no problem aiming for all the asteroids and meteors and walls or barriers in your life and taking them on like Superman here. Daring to take them on without fear or failure, regardless of what the professors in your life might be trying to get you to believe. You know yourself for yourself, and you're gonna do it, even if you have to do it like Brother Man Superman here, all by yourself.
Look, it's starting to fall now. It's picking up speed. Goodbye, Professor.
Looking up at the departing Superman, the professor says, a chance. That's all it is, just a chance. It may cost the world a dreadful price. Superman. We see Superman flying over Metropolis, then up to outer space towards the asteroid. Below, the citizens of Metropolis are standing with anxious anticipation.
He did it!
The professor says its motion stopped entirely. It's just floating in space. One of the other guys says, now it'll never hit the Earth. It'll just float out there in its own orbit like a second moon. It can't reach our atmosphere. The professor's being kind of quiet, and the guy says to him, isn't that right, Professor? Isn't that what it means? Still looking up, he says, I don't know. I don't know what it means, except every single one of us owes his life to Superman. Folks in Metropolis are cheering. Even Lois and Jimmy are breathing sighs of relief with smiles on their faces. Apparent disaster having been averted. As for Superman, Brother Man seems a little slow to get up and confused. Apparently he's found some clothes and he's put them on, and then he's stumbling from around the boulders just as a car is driving up. Clark is walking slow and touching his head like he might be hurt, but he can't be, right? The car pulls up and stops, and the driver says, "Hi, stranger, you want a lift?" Now, listen, peeps, this is back in the day where people had no problem picking folks up, and hitchhiking was safe, and it was safe for the hitchhiker and the driver back in the day. Back in the day, okay? But now, I would not advise doing this. Check out my playlist for that Twilight Zone episode, The Hitchhiker, and you'll see what I mean. It will definitely keep you from picking up folks you don't know. The driver says to Clark again, "You want a lift?" "I guess so," Clark says with a confused, distracted kind of look on his face. The chick is talking about the asteroid, and Clark is touching his head like there's something wrong with him. The chick is saying to Clark, "Did you see that thing? Wow!" And poor Clark is all confused. He doesn't know what Sister Girl is talking about.
What did you say?
I thought we was goners for sure. Superman done it. The radio said so.
Superman?
Yeah, Superman done it.
She mentions Superman, and you can tell by Clark's expression that it doesn't even register with him. Somehow he's lost his memory, and it makes you wonder if that asteroid didn't have a little piece of kryptonite in it, like the professor speculated it might. The chick finally says, "All right, get in," while pushing open the door, and Clark slowly gets in and sits down, and the pair drive off. The next scene opens with Lois tossing a copy of the Daily Planet newspaper on Perry White's desk and saying, "Here's the front page, Chief." White's on the phone. As a matter of fact, he on 2 phones, talking back and forth into each one. White says, "All right, Professor, we'll be cautious." "Sure." And he hangs up the phone, then turns his attention to the other phone. He says, "Yes, Mayor, this is White again. I'll hang on." And while he's waiting for the mayor, Lois says, "We're taking pictures on the roof. The asteroid's just circling the Earth, and we've got to get it before it's out of sight." Talking into the phone, White says, "Yes, that's much better. I'll call you the minute we get in touch with them." And he hangs up the phone. "Boy, what excitement," White says, standing. "The mayor's planning a big reception for Superman already. London observers wouldn't believe it was actually Superman who stopped it. In Rome, people are going crazy on the streets." Lois asks, "What did Professor Robinson say?" "Oh, he's a gloomy Gus," White says, warning about the effects that thing might. "But does he know what happened to Superman?" Lois asks, cutting White off. "No," White says with a small shake of his head. "He couldn't see what happened to him." Lois says, "After that terrific collision, do you think he could be expired?" White doesn't answer her, but he goes over to the intercom system on his desk and asks, "Is Clark Kent out there yet? I want him to get on the ball and find out what happened to Superman."
He isn't back yet either. Clark's still missing too.
The next scene opens with Jimmy at Clark's apartment. He's sitting and reading a newspaper when he hears footsteps outside the door. Jimmy gets up, opens the door, and looks out onto the hall. Disappointed, he closes the door and goes back to the chair and the newspaper. Jimmy is only sitting a few minutes when he hears a key in the lock and the doorknob being turned. He jumps out of the chair and rushes to open the door. When he does, Clark is there. "Mr. Kent," Jimmy says, smiling. Clark says, "Excuse me, please," and he steps into the apartment looking around confused. And Jimmy is just running on. "I've been worried sick," he tells Clark. "With you not coming to the office since last night and the chief yelling for you all the time and all that stuff about Superman." Jimmy is just running on, and Clark is looking more confused by the moment. Clark says, "I had these keys. It seemed like the right place to come to. I don't know." Jimmy says, "You're not mad at me for coming to your place. The guy downstairs let me in. I figured you wouldn't mind." "What's the matter, Mr. Kent?" Jimmy asks. "I don't know," Clark says.
Gee, you look tired.
Yes, I'm tired.
Well, it's no wonder with all this excitement going on. Why don't you go and take a good hot shower? I'll run out and get some sandwiches and coffee.
I know Superman has amnesia because I've never seen him get so close to revealing his true identity. It's kind of weird to hear him say he's tired and to watch him acting so unsteady and confused. Sort of reminds you of us, regular human beings. Which is why I so enjoy this episode, because for a little while, Superman is acting like one of us. And for a time, he is one of us. Fragile and sort of human. Clark says shower? That's a good idea. Jimmy puts on his sports coat and says, "I'll be right back." He leaves, closing the door behind him. As for Clark, he walks slowly to the closet and he sort of topples a bit and grabs one of the hooks to catch himself. When he does, a secret panel slides open and what do you know? It's a secret closet, and there's 2 Superman costumes hanging in there. Jimmy returns with the food, and you can hear water running. Jimmy walks right into the bathroom and says, "I'm back, Mr. Kent. I've got coffee and sandwiches. I'll put them on the table in the bedroom." Jimmy turns, takes the food over to the table, and starts unpacking things. All of a sudden, there's a loud crashing noise, and Jimmy runs to the bathroom to find Clark passed out on the floor. Wow! Okay, peeps, it's one thing to be discombobulated the way Superman has been acting, but for him to actually pass out on the floor, wow! What is gonna happen with Brother Man next? Next we see Clark all tucked into bed, out cold. The doorbell is buzzing, and Jimmy answers it.
All right, where is he? What's this all about?
He's in the bedroom. Finally got him into bed.
He must weigh a ton, Jimmy says. I guess he cracked his head pretty hard when he hit the floor. Lois says, "Jimmy, all that glass." I know, Jimmy says. He must be the luckiest guy who ever lived. Not a scratch on him. Not one scratch. Well, peeps, even though he's kind of discombobulated and confused on the inside, sounds like he's still the man of steel on the outside. White says, "Probably slipped on a piece of soap. Why didn't you send for a doctor instead of us?" White sort of yells at Jimmy. Right then, Clark stirs, opens his eyes, and he leans up on an elbow. He says, "Please, I'm all right." Then he says, "What happened to me?" Lois says, "Don't you know?" Clark says, "Well, no, not since I opened my eyes. I'm sorry." Jimmy asks, "Are you all right, Mr. Kent?" "What?" Clark says. "What did you call me?" "Mr. Kent." Clark looks confused. "Who?" he asks. "What's the matter? Don't any of you know me? Please answer me. Who am I?" Clark, baby. Dude, I feel for you. You sounded pretty pitiful.
Amnesia. He's lost his memory.
Oh, nonsense. Kent, wake up. You're a reporter. You work for me. Now, come on, stop this.
Peeps, you gotta love Perry White. He's just gonna order you into getting in your right mind. He's rough and he's gruff, but he clearly has a genuine affection for his people. Clark asks White if he really is a reporter working for him, and White says sure. Then he turns to Lois and asks, "Who are you?" She says, "I'm Lois Lane, reporter at the Daily Planet." White says, "Kent, I want you to stop this. Now you can't lose your memory. It's not possible. You know us. I'm White. This is Jimmy. That's Lois. This is just a joke, isn't it, Clark? Of course that's all it is, but let me tell you one thing, young man. I'm in no mood for jokes. I've had all the headaches I want from all this asteroid business. Superman is missing." "Please," Clark says, interrupting him. "You said Superman?" Clark's thinking, and he says,
Who is Superman?
Great Caesar's ghost.
Next, we're back at the observatory. The professor is studying the asteroid through the telescope and making notes. He's thinking, peeps, and it doesn't look good. He walks out of the room and onto the observation deck, where one of the other scientists is sitting and looking up at the asteroid. The scientist says, "Professor, what are they going to name it? Superman's moon?" "It's settled down," he continues, "in its own orbit, circling the Earth twice a day, nice and steady. It's cooled off, too." "Oh," the scientist adds, "I developed those pictures for you. It's got a lot of little bumps on its surface. Looks just like it ought to look. Perfectly normal." I know, the professor says. "Then what's wrong, Professor?" the scientist asks. "We're going to find out soon enough," the professor responds. "There's some government research men and scientists from the Weather Bureau flying in this afternoon for a conference. The professor adds, I'm going to see Perry White at the Daily Planet. I think we should have Superman here at the conference. I figure we'll need him. Then the professor looks up towards the sky and says, you know the Earth is still in danger from that asteroid. And he turns and walks away. Next we see Clark, Lois, and Jimmy outside the Daily Planet building. Clark says, this is where I work? Are you sure? Jimmy says, of course, Mr. Kent. Don't you remember anything? Clark shakes his head and says, it's a big city, isn't it? Lots of big buildings, he says, looking around. Lois says, I guess the chief had the right idea. When you get behind your own desk and start pounding your old typewriter, you'll snap right out of it. The trio turns, leading Clark towards the entrance, when they're suddenly covered by the shadow of the asteroid. They look up and Jimmy says, they say it's gonna cross the sun like that nearly every day. What are you talking about? Clark asks. That's always been up there, hasn't it? It's called the moon, isn't it? That does it, Lois says, taking his arm and practically strong-arming a brother through the door. They go up to the floor where Clark's office is located, and Jimmy asks, doesn't anything come back to you, Mr. Kent? Clark shakes his head and says, no, I'm sorry, Jimmy. That's your name, isn't it? Before Jimmy can respond, White comes bursting out of his office yelling,
Kent, I want to see you.
Well, that's me. Yes, sir?
Oh, wait. Chief, it's hopeless. All you can do is get him a good doctor.
I'm no time for that.
He takes Clark's arm and leads him around a corner to his office. They stop, and White points to the nameplate on the door and says, see that? Home again. White then opens the door and gives Ken a little push inside. Brother Man is bound and determined to force Clark into remembering. Kent looks around the office like he's never seen it before. He takes a seat, and White says this to him. I want you to find Superman for me. I don't care how you do it. You've done it for me before, so I want you to find him. And Clark says,
Well, do you know what he looks like, sir?
yeah, he looks like that dude who's staring back at you in the mirror in the morning. Poor Perry White is speechless, which doesn't happen often. Finally, White says, now see here, Kent. Lois cuts him off and says, I told you, Chief, it's useless. White tells everybody to be quiet, and he says to Clark, Kent, the whole world needs you. Don't you understand? We need him in a hurry. Why? What is it? Lois asks with dread. White raises his voice and his finger at Clark and says, you're the only one who's ever been able to contact him. You've got to find him. Clark says, well, sir, I'll do my best. I'll study up on him real hard. I'll look through the files downstairs and I'll ask everybody I meet. And how about putting an ad in the paper? White says, no. I'm sorry. You just rest for a few days. You can cover the flower show with Jimmy while the world's coming to an end, he shouts. And then he storms out of the office with Lois trailing after him. And Clark and Jimmy just sit there looking at one another. White enters his office and the professor is there. It's like Lois doesn't even see him as she asks White, what did you mean by the world coming to an end? White hands her a piece of paper and says, read this. It just came in over the wire. Tidal wave down in Brazil, Lois says. Why, that's dreadful. I'll get right on the story. Just a minute, Miss Lane, the professor says. This tidal wave is just the beginning. I don't understand, Lois says. Does it have something to do with the asteroid that Superman stopped? The professor says, Superman just sidetracked it. That's the trouble. It should have been destroyed. You see, its gravitational influence is upsetting the Earth's rotation. White says, I just had a call from our bureau in Cairo. North Africa's having the worst wind and sandstorm it's ever had. The professor says, the seismic graph I've observed shows an earthquake, but we haven't determined its origin yet. Lois says, you mean all these disturbances were caused by the asteroid? The professor says, what other explanation can there be? That thing up there might disturb the balance of the entire solar system. I don't know, the professor continues. Just find Superman, you understand? Find him. And Lois turns and leaves. We next see that Clark is at home. He opens the secret panel in the closet and takes out one of the costumes. He's looking at it, peeps, like wondering what its presence in his apartment might mean. Clark steps into the other room and holds the costume up. Then he hears a sound in the hall, and he quickly hides the costume under the cushion of a chair, and he sits down. Right then, Jimmy pops his head in, smiles, and says to Clark, okay to come in? Clark says, sure, Jimmy, come on in. Jimmy steps over to Clark and says, are you feeling better? Oh yes, thanks, Jim, Clark says, just the tiniest bit distracted. Continuing, Clark says, I've been thinking about Superman. Do you suppose it's his costume that gives him this peculiar power? Jimmy says, I don't follow you. You know what I mean, Clark says. They haven't been able to find him, and they've got to. The world may not last another day, but suppose someone else found his costume.
No, wait, Mr. Kent, that's not right. Superman explained it to me once. That costume doesn't have any particular powers. Only Superman can do super things. Nobody else. Nobody.
Well, someone has got to try and save this world of ours.
You hear that, peeps? Even with amnesia, even with him not knowing he's the very solution the world needs, there's that something inside of him that's saying, somebody's got to try to save this world of ours, and it may as well be me. Peeps, his true identity is speaking to him through the amnesia and confusion he has about himself. Come on, my people, can't you see? The Superman and the Superwoman is inside you whether you know it or not. Just like Clark's still Superman, though he can't remember being Superman. And whether you know it or not, you, my people, are the very solution to the world's ills. You don't have to believe you have some power. Like Clark, you simply have to get up and say, someone has got to try to save this world, this neighborhood, this community, city, village, family, these little children. Someone has got to try to save them. And it may as well be me. Go, Clark, go, my brother. With his mind made up and his resolve cemented, Clark shows Jimmy to the door. He says, you came over to see if I was all right? Well, I am. Thank you very much. Now, if you don't mind running along, and he's hustling Jimmy across the room to the door. Clark says, I've got some things to do. He gives Jimmy a soft push out the door, and he's gone. Clark goes back over to the chair he was sitting in, and he retrieves the costume from under the cushion. He goes into the bedroom and puts the costume on. A few minutes later, we see Clark step in front of the full-length mirror wearing the Superman costume. And he's apparently wearing his Clark Kent glasses too. He touches the costume and flexes in front of the mirror. Then he goes over to the chair and sits down. He sits there as if he's thinking, and then in frustration he slams his fist down on the end table.
Professor Roberts, the observatory.
Well, apparently Superman has regained his memory and he's off to finish the job and save the day. Over at the observatory, the professor is showing White, Lois, and Jimmy some type of mechanism. He says just this can save the world. Lois says, but without Superman it's useless. Jimmy says, couldn't the Army or the Navy or somebody put it on a guided missile and shoot it towards the asteroid? The professor says, I'm afraid they haven't developed a guided missile yet that can go that far out into space. Lois says, so the only answer is still Superman. Yeah, Jimmy says, and nobody knows where, and then Jimmy shouts, look! The group looks up and sees Superman heading towards them.
What can I do for you, Professor?
This box. Do you think you can carry this out to the asteroid?
Yes, sir.
The professor directs Superman regarding the switch and levers to push in order to activate the device. He tells Superman the atomic energy people are positive that there's enough incendiary chemicals in the device to destroy, and before he can finish his statement, a shadow falls on them all. It's the asteroid passing in front of the sun. Superman has a very serious look on his face when he turns back to the group and he says,
Goodbye, Professor. Miss Lane, everyone.
You sound as though you don't expect to come back.
I may not.
Superman's not being overly dramatic, peeps. He's just remembering the last time he tangled with that asteroid. As if to allay the group's concerns, the professor says, you had a pretty rough time of it before. The asteroid was burning then. Since you've changed its orbit, it's cooled. Now perhaps the elements that almost took you out were altered in the cooling process. I don't know, the professor says. It's just a chance, nothing more. Superman says, I understand, sir, and he flies away. With a steady focus, Superman flies to the asteroid, his earthly home in the distance. While back at the observatory, the professor is watching Superman through the telescope, surrounded by scientists and Superman's dearest friends. Superman lands on the asteroid and prepares the device.
Well, here goes.
And there's Superman flying home. Next we see Clark back on the job working on a story. Lois picks up the pages and reads, thus the asteroid was completely incinerated and the world saved from possible annihilation. Superman, who was slightly injured by his first collision in space, seemed to be completely recovered when he returned to Earth. Wait a minute, Lois says. How do you know all that? Oh, didn't I tell you, Clark says. I have my memory back again. Really, Clark, Lois says with skepticism in her voice. Just because you got hit on the head, that's no sign that that's what happened to Superman. Why not, Clark says. I think we have something in common. As a matter of fact, I know who he is now. Lois says, oh, you do? Well, come on, who?
Oh, just knock me on the head sometime. You'll find out.
Mr. Kent, I'm really very glad you're well again, but I'm not so sure it's much of an improvement.
And there you have it, my peeps. The Adventures of Superman. Panic in the Sky. I have a handful of favorite episodes, and this one tops the list. You've got Clark/Superman not having a clue who he is. This is a Superman we've never seen before. Not confident, strong, and determined in his cause, but a confused guy who has to rely on the kindness of his friends, people he doesn't even remember. Yet they were there for him. He was not alone in this. I'd like to think that this experience left Clark and Superman with a strengthened sense of community and a renewed conviction that this was truly where he belonged and what he was supposed to be doing with his life. Well, my people, That's my takeaway concerning these two pretend characters who, in a way, exemplify real true life. To my subscribers, shout out to you. You wouldn't believe the fun you're bringing to this old retired woman's life by just showing up and viewing my content. You too, viewers, and I hope that you'll one day join the party and become subscribers. Won't you consider it? Please do. And to all, please take a quick second to like this content. It'll help the channel spread. Now y'all be sure to treat one another with kindness and treat yourself well too. Until next time.